They called it ugly, cheap, and unrefined, a gun so simple that even seasoned Allied soldiers laughed at it. But deep in the suffocating jungles of New Guinea, this ugly weapon would do what no elegant British rifle, no powerful American machine gun, and no high-precision European firearm could ever accomplish. It didn't just kill, it survived the mud, the rot, the rain, the darkness, the impossible. And the Japanese infantry, they learned the hard way that the deadliest weapon is not the prettiest, it's the one that never stops firing. Stay till the end, because the moment you hear how this weapon rewrote jungle warfare, you will never look at a simple gun the same way again. The first time the Australian soldiers truly understood what the ugly gun could do was a moment born out of exhaustion, fear, and the kind of hopelessness only jungle warfare can create. The Kokoda track was not a battlefield. It was a slow, suffocating torture chamber. Days of rain had turned the ground into a thick brown soup. Rifles rusted even while slung on shoulders. Sweat mixed with mud until both felt the same. Every breath tasted like rot. Every shadow looked like an enemy. The jungle didn't just surround the soldiers, it swallowed them whole. For most Allied troops, their weapons were burdens more than tools. The famous Lee Enfields jammed when soaked. American Thompsons were powerful but temperamental. Parts rusted fast, magazines filled with muck, and once the firing mechanism got wet, good luck firing a second round. The Japanese, perfectly adapted to jungle warfare, moved like ghosts. Their Arisaka rifles and Type 100 submachine guns held up a little better in the climate, giving them a small but deadly advantage. Every Australian soldier knew that if the Japanese attacked after heavy rain, their chances of fighting back were slim. This was the exact environment the 39th Battalion found themselves in. Days of trekking through impossible terrain had broken their spirits. Boots were falling apart, uniforms were soaked, and their weapons, supposed to be their lifeline, were barely functional. When the Japanese launched a sudden, violent charge through the undergrowth, it felt like the jungle itself had turned against them. The enemy came shouting, sprinting through vines and fog, confident, fast, and ready to overwhelm the exhausted Australians. Rifles were raised, fingers squeezed, but instead of fire there were only clicks. Dead, lifeless clicks. Nothing strikes fear into a soldier like a weapon that refuses to obey. Panic spread. Some tried desperately to clear mud from their bolts. Others swung their rifles like clubs, knowing close combat meant almost certain death against Japanese bayonets. Then came the moment that changed everything. Private Harris, a man no different from the others, tired, wet, frustrated, held a gun that most soldiers had mocked, the Owen. It looked wrong. The magazine stuck out of the top. The barrel was thick and plain. The paint was chipped. It had none of the sleek character or mechanical prestige of the British or American weapons. Many had joked that it looked like a plumber had welded scraps together. But when Harris squeezed the trigger, the ugly gun screamed to life with a perfect, uninterrupted burst. The Japanese charge faltered instantly. A wall of bullets ripped through the foliage, cutting down the first attackers and scattering the rest. Soldiers nearby turned their heads in shock. In a place where even breathing was hard, the Owen fired as if the jungle didn't exist. No jam, no hesitation, no choking on mud or water. Just pure, relentless firepower. In those seconds, the Australians realized something profound. This strange, underestimated weapon had done what none of their other guns could do. It worked in the rain. It worked in the mud. It worked when everything else failed. The jungle had tested every weapon, and only the ugly one had passed. And from that moment, the soldiers knew the Owen gun wasn't just reliable. It was a lifeline, a silent promise that no matter how brutal the environment became, they would always have one weapon that refused to die. The jungles of the Pacific were not merely landscapes. They were living, breathing enemies. They swallowed sound, light, and even the spirit of the men who entered them. The heat was a constant suffocation, a heavy blanket that clung to the skin, turning every movement into a battle. Moisture gathered on every surface, helmets, uniforms, weapons, and sunk deep into metal and wood. What the soldiers learned quickly was that the jungle didn't just test your endurance, it tested your equipment, and most Allied weapons failed that test miserably. British rifles, designed for open fields and dry climates, were helpless in this new world. Their bolts grew stiff with rust. Water seeped into the chambers, and fine mud, almost like chocolate paste, crept into every gap, clogging the mechanism. The American Thompson, famous for its firepower, suddenly became a fragile machine. Its precision, crafted parts meant to slide smoothly in controlled conditions, froze the moment mud touched them. It would fire a burst or two, then jam so thoroughly that soldiers had to pick it apart like a stubborn puzzle, all while the jungle around them whispered with the threat of ambush. Even basic cartridges suffered. Paper-thin moisture barriers dissolved in the humidity. Ammunition became unreliable. Bullets swelled microscopically, just enough to jam inside the chamber. A simple firefight could transform into a nightmare of misfires and useless metal. And the jungle didn't care if you were ready or not. It attacked with rainstorms that erupted out of clear skies. It dropped vines and branches onto soldiers' heads. It filled foxholes with mud. It drowned trenches and turned pathways into swamp-like traps. Every step forward was a gamble. Every day a new chance for your weapon to become a liability instead of a lifeline. Japanese infantry had an edge because they were trained and equipped with weapons more suited to the environment. Their rifles were simpler, less likely to jam, and their troops had experience fighting in humidity, heavy regions of Southeast Asia. They moved lightly and quietly through terrain that strangled Allied progress. Their ambushes were timed perfectly, taking advantage of the fact that half the time the Allied troops could not trust their rifles to fire even a single round. This difference was deadly. There were countless reports of Allied patrols unable to return fire during sudden attacks because their weapons simply refused to work. Soldiers would slam their bolts, curse under their breath, try to wipe away sludge. But the jungle was unforgiving. If a weapon didn't fire instantly, it might as well have been a stick. And this is where the Owen gun began to reveal its true worth. Unlike the other weapons, the Owen wasn't designed in a boardroom or a foreign factory. It was born in Australia, shaped by people who understood the very jungles their soldiers were fighting in. Its design wasn't delicate, it was deliberate. A sealed receiver kept out mud. A top-mounted magazine used gravity to feed rounds more reliably. Water could pour through the barrel, and it would still fire moments later. And most importantly, it was built to function when completely coated in the grime and sweat that defined jungle combat. While the jungle claimed every other Allied weapon, jamming bolts, rusting barrels, soaking ammunition, the Owen operated like the environment didn't exist. It became the first gun that soldiers trusted more than the ground under their feet. Because in a place where the jungle destroyed everything, the Owen gun refused to surrender. Australian engineers didn't set out to create a beautiful weapon. They set out to create a weapon that could survive in a world where nothing else did. The Owen gun was not the result of massive factories, advanced laboratories, or military boards filled with decorated officers. It began with a young inventor named Evelyn Owen, a man working out of a small workshop with limited tools and even fewer resources. His design wasn't sleek or polished. It was raw, practical, and built on a simple question. What kind of gun can survive the jungle? The jungles of New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Papua weren't theoretical battlegrounds. They were unforgiving environments where machinery died quickly. Owen understood that soldiers didn't need elegance. They needed reliability. So he created a submachine gun that embraced simplicity. Every curve, every angle, every internal component was crafted with one purpose: to keep firing no matter what tried to stop it. Owen's first prototypes were dismissed. Officers laughed at the awkward magazine sticking out of the top. They complained that it looked unbalanced, ugly, even amateurish. Britain preferred the stench, cheap, fast to produce, but notoriously unreliable in dirt. America believed in the Thompson, powerful, expensive, precise, but hopeless in mud. Australia was encouraged to rely on its allies, but Owen refused. He pushed, tested, experimented, and proved again and again that his plumber's nightmare had something no other weapon offered: immunity to the jungle's cruelty. The breakthrough came during rigorous field testing. Engineers submerged the weapon in wet mud, thick, sticky mud that clung to metal like glue. They shook it out, wiped the barrel with a sleeve, loaded it, and pulled the trigger. The Owen fired without hesitation, spitting out mud droplets as if the jungle itself couldn't choke it. Other weapons jammed instantly. The Sten failed before the first round left the chamber. Even the Thompson, a respected machine gun, coughed and died. What made the Owen different wasn't just durability. It was intelligent design. The bolt and firing mechanisms were completely sealed off from external muck. The top mounted magazine used gravity so even if the springs weakened or dirt clung to the feed lips, rounds still dropped cleanly into place. The barrel was simple to detach and easy to clean in the field. Soldiers could strip the weapon while exhausted, shaking, or even half, blind in darkness. No tiny screws, no delicate springs, no fragile parts that snapped when soaked. The engineers also realized something crucial. The jungle wasn't just wet. It was constantly throwing debris at the soldiers. Leaves, grit, vines, dripping sap, insects. The Owen was built to shrug off all of it. Its tolerances were intentionally wide enough to avoid the precision, clogging problem that ruined so many foreign guns. It didn't rely on perfect conditions. It thrived in chaos. As the war progressed, production scaled up, but the design stayed true to its origins. Factories reinforced its frame. Painters coated it in thick, durable finishes. Australian troops began requesting it specifically, refusing to head into the jungle with anything else. Word spread quickly. American and British units noticed how the Owen kept firing even after being dropped into rivers, dragged through swamps, or buried under rotting leaves during ambushes. In the end, Australian engineers hadn't just built a weapon. They had built a partner for every soldier fighting in the darkest, wettest corners of the Pacific. A weapon that didn't rust, didn't choke, didn't quit. A weapon born from necessity, shaped by the environment, and perfected by the hands of those who understood exactly what survival demanded. The psychological effect of the Owen gun on Japanese troops was something no military planner had predicted. On paper, it was just another submachine gun, short-ranged, simple, and unremarkable compared to the larger, louder weapons used by the Americans or British. But war isn't fought on paper. War is fought in moments of fear, shock, and uncertainty. And in the jungle, where visibility barely reached 10 meters and every sound carried like a whisper in a cathedral, the Owen gun created a presence that lived inside the minds of those who faced it. Japanese infantry were trained to exploit weaknesses. They relied heavily on stealth, surprise, and lightning, fast charges, knowing that Allied rifles often jammed in wet conditions. Many of their early successes in the Pacific came from attacking in sudden burst, striking before Allied soldiers had time to react. For months, this tactic worked flawlessly. They were certain the jungle belonged to them. They believed the environment favored their weapons and their methods. Then the Owen gun arrived, and their confidence began to fracture. The first time Japanese troops encountered the Owen in full force, they didn't see the weapon. They heard it. A short, sharp, brutal burst that didn't stop. Unlike other Allied weapons, which sputtered and choked in the rain, the Owen produced a steady, reliable roar. It was unmistakable. In night operations, the sound alone was enough to make Japanese soldiers hesitate. They knew that where that sound came from, there was a soldier with a weapon that did not fail. One diary entry recovered from a fallen Japanese sergeant described it perfectly. Enemy gun, green color, fires even in the water, impossible to escape when it begins. To Japanese troops, The notion of a weapon that could fire immediately after being soaked was terrifying. Their own firearms needed careful maintenance. Mud was a known enemy. Rain was a constant threat. They understood the limitations of every gun in the jungle, so when they met one with no weaknesses, it felt almost supernatural. Ambush tactics, once their strongest weapon, started losing effectiveness. They would leap from the foliage expecting the familiar click of a jammed Allied rifle. Instead, they faced a sudden, flawless burst of Owen gun fire that cut through the underbrush like a swarm of hornets. That reliability changed everything. The Japanese weren't just facing bullets, they were facing unpredictability. They could no longer count on the environment to weaken their enemy's weapons, and in war, losing predictability is losing power. Foggy night raids became particularly dangerous for them. They could hear Australians approaching, moving slowly, whispering commands, branches snapping under boots. Normally, this would be their moment to strike. But the realization that these soldiers carried Owens, a weapon that could fire instantly even after hours of crawling through soaked grass, created hesitation. That hesitation turned into fear. Fear turned into mistakes. And mistakes in the jungle meant death. Some Japanese patrols even began reporting encounters where Australian soldiers fired after falling into streams or rolling through mudslides that defied everything they understood about firearms. To them, the Owen gun became a symbol of something unnatural, an enemy weapon that ignored the laws of the jungle. And when a weapon earns a reputation of being unstoppable, it becomes deadlier without firing a single bullet. The Owen gun didn't just defeat Japanese troops physically, it eroded their confidence. It broke the psychological advantage they once held in the Pacific. It made them rethink their tactics, doubt their assumptions, and fear engagements they previously initiated with certainty. In the end, the Owen gun's true power wasn't just mechanical, it was mental. It planted a quiet, persistent terror in the minds of those who faced it, proving that sometimes the strongest weapon on the battlefield is fear itself. Frontline stories about the Owen gun spread long before official reports ever reached headquarters. They were passed quietly between soldiers, shared in dugouts, whispered on night watch, repeated during muddy marches. These stories didn't come from propaganda or factory promises. They came from men who had seen the worst of the jungle and discovered that only one weapon stood between them and death. Every tale carried the same message. The Owen didn't just work well, it worked when nothing else could. One of the most famous incidents came from a patrol near Boona. A small Australian unit was moving through swamp water so deep it reached their chests. Leonfields and Thompsons were held above their heads. Wrapped in whatever cloth, the soldiers had to keep the barrels dry. The rain was relentless, hammering the water around them like millions of tiny bullets. The jungle was alive with leeches, insects, and unseen movement. Every man knew that if the Japanese attacked, their rifles would be nearly useless. But one soldier, Corporal McCall, carried an Owen gun slung casually over his shoulder, barrel dipping in and out of the water with every step. His comrades warned him constantly, "Lift it up, mate, you'll ruin the bloody thing." But McCall trusted his weapon. He knew what it could endure. He simply grinned and said, "If she jams, I'll buy you all a drink." Moments later, the undergrowth exploded with gunfire. Japanese troops opened up from concealed positions. Chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled for cover, struggling to ready their soaked rifles, but McCall didn't hesitate. He lifted the Owen straight out of the swamp, water streaming off the muzzle, and fired a flawless, raging burst into the foliage. The weapon didn't cough, didn't hesitate, didn't choke on the water dripping from its barrel. That burst gave the patrol the seconds they needed to regroup, return fire, and fight their way out alive. When the battle was over, McCall simply shrugged and said, "Still owe no one a drink." Another frontline account came from a nighttime ambush near Gona. An Australian section had settled into defensive positions along a muddy ridge. Rain hammered the canopy. Visibility was nearly zero. Suddenly, Japanese soldiers launched a silent charge uphill, relying on the darkness and the element of surprise. Several Australians tried firing their rifles, only to hear horrifying clicks. Mud had seeped in during the day. Private Lawson, lying half buried in mud, felt Japanese soldiers approaching within meters. He jammed his thumb against the bolt of his Owen, wiped the front sight with a muddy sleeve, and fired. The burst lit up the ridge. The gun didn't jam despite being half packed with debris. It held the line long enough for the rest of the section to react and push back the assault. Later, Lawson's sergeant inspected the weapon and said, "This thing shouldn't even work." Lawson replied, "Tell it that. It won't listen." There was also the story of an Owen being dropped during a chaotic retreat, falling down a slope, smacking against rocks, and disappearing into a puddle of sludge. The soldier retrieved it minutes later, expecting the worst. Instead, he shook out the mud, slapped in a fresh magazine, and it fired as if nothing had happened. Word of these stories traveled fast. Soldiers began begging quartermasters for Owens. Units wrote formal requests to replace every other submachine gun. Even American and British troops fighting alongside Australians tried to trade their own weapons for the little green gun with a reputation for invincibility. By the end of the war, the frontline tales all echoed the same truth. The Owen gun wasn't just reliable. It was a soldier's closest friend. A weapon that didn't complain, didn't fail, and didn't betray its owner in the harshest conditions imaginable. The stories weren't heroic exaggerations. They were proof that in the mud, rain, and darkness of Pacific combat, the Owen never stopped fighting. By the final years of the Pacific campaign, the Owen gun had transformed from a ridiculed experiment into one of the most respected weapons carried by Allied soldiers. But its true legacy wasn't written in factories or official documents. It was written quietly, in the thick jungles where survival depended on trust. In a war where countless weapons earned fame for their firepower, precision, or engineering brilliance, the Owen gun earned its reputation through something far more valuable: reliability in the harshest battlefield nature could create. Its journey from a mocked design to a battlefield legend proved something remarkable. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones that no one sees coming. The jungle was a ruthless judge. Many Allied weapons entered the Pacific with glowing reputations established in Europe or on training grounds. They were praised for accuracy, craftsmanship, or the cleverness of their engineering. But the jungle cared nothing for reputation. It crushed metal with rust, devoured wooden stocks with fungus, and choked finely tuned mechanisms with mud. A weapon's worth wasn't measured by its design. It was measured by whether it fired in the worst moment, when everything depended on it. This was the environment where the Owen gun rose above every other Allied weapon. While the American Thompson struggled with mud clogging its action, while the British Sten jammed at the first sign of moisture, and while rifles failed after mere hours in the rain, the Owen proved immune to all of it. Word spread across units that it could be buried, submerged, dropped, and still function. Soldiers began describing it not just as a submachine gun, but as a symbol of survival. In their diaries, letters home, and post, or recollections, they spoke with the same tone: the Owen never let us down. Its impact went far beyond the physical fight. It changed the way Australian troops fought. Patrols became more confident. Night raids, once dangerous gambles, became calculated strikes. Ambushes turned from desperate reactions into controlled engagements. Soldiers who had once feared that their rifles would betray them in a firefight now held a weapon that simply refused to die. That confidence reshaped the battlefield. When men trust their weapons, they move differently, react faster, and fight with a steadier hand. The Owen gun gave them that confidence, and in doing so, changed their effectiveness in the jungle. The weapon's reputation soon spread beyond the Australian ranks. American GI who witnessed the Owen in action during joint operations were stunned by its endurance. British soldiers, accustomed to the temperamental Sten, tried desperately to trade for Owens whenever possible. Even officers who once dismissed the weapon as crude or amateurish began requesting it because they saw the truth. In the jungle, beauty, and sophistication were weaknesses. Function was king, and the Owen gun ruled. Its legacy continued long after the war ended. Many veterans swore that no other weapon had earned their trust the way the Owen did. Some credited it with saving their lives multiple times. Others simply described it as the best jungle gun ever built. Military historians later agreed that no Allied firearm matched the Owen's reliability in tropical warfare. It remained in service for decades, outlasting newer, more advanced weapons because nothing could replace the simple durability it offered. What made the Owen gun a standout was not its appearance, nor its fire rate, nor its range. It was the way it fit perfectly into the unforgiving jungle environment. It was a weapon built not to impress, but to endure, designed by people who understood exactly what soldiers needed when fighting in conditions more hostile than the enemy itself. By the end of the war, one truth had become undeniable. The Owen gun didn't just serve Australia, it protected it. And in the darkest, wettest, most brutal corners of the Pacific, it stood as a quiet hero, proving that sometimes the deadliest weapons are the simplest ones, the ones that refuse to quit when everything else falls apart.